Sterile Millionaire marries his gardener, and in the end everyone is left speechless. After giving him 3 healthy children, what was told to him to be impossible. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. The morning sun cast long shadows across the immaculately maintained gardens of Thornfield Hall, where Alexander Montgomery stood at his study window, a cup of untouched tea growing cold in his hands. At 52, he had achieved everything society deemed important: a successful investment firm, a sprawling estate in the Cotswolds, and more wealth than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. Yet, the vast mansion echoed with an emptiness that no amount of money could fill. Running his fingers through his silver-streaked dark hair, Alexander watched as his groundskeeping staff began their morning routine. His eyes lingered on an unfamiliar figure, a young woman he hadn't seen before, who moved with purpose among the flower beds. There was something different about her approach. Unlike the mechanical precision of his usual gardeners, she seemed to caress each plant, taking time to appreciate every bloom. "Harrison," he called to his butler, who materialized instantly at his side. "Who is the new person in the garden?" "That would be Miss Rose Gardner, sir. She came highly recommended by the Hartley estate. Mrs. Phillips hired her yesterday to replace Mr. Thompson, who retired last month." Alexander nodded, his attention drawn back to the woman who was now carefully pruning his prized rose bushes. Even from this distance, he could see the gentle smile on her face as she worked. It was refreshing. Most of his employees maintained a stern professionalism that, while efficient, had always felt cold. Later that morning, as Alexander walked through his gardens during his daily routine, he found himself gravitating toward the area where the new gardener worked. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd initially thought, probably in her early 30s, with warm brown eyes and sun-kissed skin that spoke of hours spent outdoors. "Good morning," he said, surprising himself by initiating conversation. "You must be Miss Gardner." She looked up, brushing a loose strand of honey-colored hair from her face. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery." "Yes, I'm Rose." Her smile was genuine, reaching her eyes in a way that made them crinkle at the corners. "I hope you don't mind, but I've made some small changes to the rose garden layout. The white roses weren't getting enough sunlight in their previous position." Alexander raised an eyebrow, impressed by her directness. Most new employees would have asked permission before making any changes. "You seem very confident in your decisions, Miss Gardner." "Plants tell you what they need if you listen carefully enough," she replied, running her fingers along a rose petal. "Sometimes we forget that nature has its own wisdom. We can't always control everything, can we?" Her words struck a chord deep within him. Control, that's what his entire life had been about. Controlling his company's growth, controlling his public image, controlling his emotions. The only thing he couldn't control was the cruel twist of fate that had left him unable to father children, a secret he'd carried alone for the past 20 years. "Would you mind showing me these changes you've made?" he found himself asking, genuinely curious about her perspective. For the next hour, Rose walked him through her vision for the garden, explaining how each plant could thrive with proper placement and care. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and Alexander found himself seeing his carefully manicured gardens in a new light. She spoke about the flowers as if they were old friends, each with their own personality and needs. "You see this rose here?" She pointed to a struggling plant. "It's not weak, it's just been fighting too hard to be something it's not. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let things be what they naturally are." Alexander felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. How many years had he spent fighting against his own nature, presenting a perfect facade to the world while hiding his deepest pain? As the days turned into weeks, Alexander found himself taking longer walks in the garden, always managing to time them when Rose would be working. Their conversations grew from polite exchanges about plants to deeper discussions about life, philosophy, and the simple beauty of the natural world. She challenged his perspectives in ways that both unsettled and intrigued him. Where he saw imperfections that needed fixing, she saw character. Where he sought control, she embraced organic growth. In her presence, the weight of his secret felt lighter, though he still couldn't bring himself to share it. One evening, as the sun set over the Cotswold Hills, Alexander stood in his study, watching Rose pack up her tools for the day. The garden had transformed under her care, becoming more vibrant and alive than ever before. But it wasn't just the garden that was changing. He felt different too. as if her presence had awakened something long dormant within him. For the first time in decades, Alexander Montgomery felt the stirrings of hope. Not the calculated optimism of business projections or investment returns, but something deeper and more profound. It terrified him, this unfamiliar vulnerability, yet he couldn't deny the way his heart lifted whenever Rose was near. As she disappeared down the garden path, Alexander made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Tomorrow, he would ask Rose to join him for dinner, not as his employee, but as his equal. It was time to let someone into his carefully guarded world, even if it meant risking everything he'd built to protect himself from pain. The invitation to dinner caught Rose completely off guard. She stood in Mr. Montgomery's study, soil still under her fingernails from the morning's work, as he nervously explained his request. The usually composed businessman seemed almost boyish in his uncertainty, and something about his vulnerability touched her deeply. "I understand if you'd prefer not to mix professional and personal matters," Alexander said, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on his desk. "But I've greatly enjoyed our conversations in the garden, and I thought perhaps—" "I'd love to," Rose interrupted, surprising them both with her directness, "though I'm afraid I don't own anything suitable for fine dining." Alexander's face lit up with relief and something else. Joy, perhaps. "Then allow me to take you somewhere less formal. There's a lovely pub in the village that serves excellent food. Would tomorrow evening suit you?" And so began a courtship that defied all social conventions. The wealthy businessman and the gardener shared meals at local pubs, took long walks through the countryside, and spent hours talking about everything and nothing. Rose found herself drawn to Alexander's complexity, the successful exterior that masked a deeply sensitive soul. News of their relationship spread quickly through the village and eventually reached London's high society circles. The whispers began almost immediately. Gold digger, some called her. Midlife crisis, others said of him. But in each other's company, these voices faded into insignificance. One evening, as they sat in Alexander's conservatory watching the sunset, Rose noticed him growing increasingly distant. She'd learned to read his moods over the past few months, and something was clearly troubling him. "Alex," she said softly, using the nickname she'd given him. "What's wrong?" He was quiet for a long moment, his face traced with shadows. "There's something I need to tell you, Rose. Something I should have told you before things between us became serious." Rose reached for his hand, feeling the slight tremor in his fingers. "Whatever it is, we can face it together." "I can't have children," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I've known for 20 years. It's why my first marriage ended. Margaret, my ex-wife, she wanted a family and I couldn't give her that. We tried everything, but the doctors were clear. The problem was with me." Rose felt her heart ache for the pain she heard in his voice. "Oh, Alex, I've built this whole empire," he continued, gesturing at the grand house around them. "But I have no one to leave it to. No legacy except cold business deals and empty rooms." He turned to her, his eyes vulnerable. "I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid. You're young, Rose. You deserve the chance to have a family." Rose stood up and moved to kneel in front of him, taking both his hands in hers. "Alex, look at me. Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see a man who has so much love to give. I see someone who's learned to appreciate beauty in unexpected places. I see the way you've changed since we met, how you've learned to let go of control and embrace uncertainty. But I can't give you children," he repeated, the words heavy with regret. "Life has a way of surprising us," Rose said, thinking of the gardens she tended. "Sometimes the seeds we plant grow in ways we never expected. Besides, there are many ways to create a family, to leave a legacy. It's not just about biological children." Alexander stared at her in wonder. "How do you do that? How do you always find hope in everything?" "Because hope is like the flowers in your garden," she smiled. "Sometimes it just needs the right conditions to bloom." In that moment, Alexander made another decision that would alter their lives forever. Rising from his chair, he pulled Rose to her feet and then, to her absolute astonishment, lowered himself to one knee. "Rose Gardner," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've taught me to see beauty in imperfection, to find strength in vulnerability, and to believe in possibilities I'd long ago dismissed. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The word yes had barely left her lips before he was pulling her into his arms, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. As they held each other in the fading light, neither could have imagined the remarkable journey that lay ahead of them, a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about miracles, love, and the power of believing in the impossible. The announcement of Alexander Montgomery's engagement to his gardener hit London's social circles like a thunderbolt on a clear day. The Times' society pages buzzed with barely concealed shock, while the more sensational tabloids ran wild with speculation. In the exclusive lounges of the capital's gentlemen's clubs, Alexander's peers debated whether he had finally lost his mind. Lady Victoria Pembroke, self-appointed guardian of social propriety, nearly choked on her Earl Grey when the news reached her. "A gardener?" she sputtered to her equally horrified luncheon companions at the Ritz. "Alexander Montgomery, one of Britain's most eligible bachelors, is marrying a woman who digs in the dirt for a living?" The whispers and rumours spread through London's elite social circles like wildfire. Some claimed Rose was a cunning social climber who had seduced the wealthy businessman. Others suggested Alexander was having some sort of midlife crisis, predicting the engagement would be called off once he came to his senses. But at Thornfield Hall, surrounded by the gardens that had brought them together, Alexander and Rose remained in their own peaceful bubble. That is, until the morning Alexander's sister Eleanor arrived unannounced, her Bentley throwing gravel as it came to an abrupt stop in the circular driveway. "Darling brother," Eleanor called out as she swept into the study, her Hermes scarf trailing dramatically behind her. "Please tell me the papers have it wrong. You haven't really proposed to your gardener, have you?" Alexander stood calmly behind his desk, already having anticipated this confrontation. "Hello, Eleanor. Yes, I have proposed to Rose and she has accepted. I was planning to tell you personally, but it seems the news travelled faster than I expected." Eleanor sank into a leather armchair, pressing her manicured fingers to her temples. "Alex, darling, have you completely lost your mind? What about Catherine Blackwood? She's been practically throwing herself at you for years and she comes from an excellent family." "I'm not interested in Catherine Blackwood or any other society woman you might suggest," Alexander replied firmly. "I love Rose and I'm going to marry her." "Love?" Eleanor scoffed. "Alex, you're 52 years old, not some romantic hero in a novel. This is real life, and in real life, people of our position have responsibilities. What will the board members think? What about our family name?" Before Alexander could respond, a gentle knock at the door interrupted them. Rose entered, carrying a tray with tea and freshly baked scones. She had heard the arrival of the Bentley, and guessing the purpose of the visit, had decided to face it head-on. "I thought you might enjoy some refreshments," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in the room. "The scones are still warm, and I've brought your favourite Earl Grey, Alexander." Eleanor studied Rose with the sharp eye of a society matron assessing a potential threat. To her surprise, she found herself noting the younger woman's natural grace as she set down the tray and began pouring tea. There was no servility in her manner, but neither was there any arrogance. She moved with quiet confidence and genuine warmth. "Mrs. Blackwood Smith," Rose addressed Eleanor directly, using her formal married name, "I know this must be difficult for you to accept. I want you to know that I love your brother deeply. Not for his position or his wealth, but for the remarkable man he is." Eleanor found herself momentarily speechless, thrown off balance by Rose's directness and sincerity. She had expected to find a calculating social climber, not this forthright woman who met her gaze without flinching. "My dear," Eleanor finally managed, her tone slightly softened, "I'm sure you believe what you're saying. But you must understand our world is different from yours. The expectations, the responsibilities—" "With all due respect," Rose interrupted gently, "perhaps it's those very differences that make our relationship work. Your brother has taught me about art, literature, and fine wine. I've taught him about finding joy in simple things, about letting go of rigid expectations. We complement each other." Alexander moved to stand beside Rose, taking her hand in his. The gesture was not lost on Eleanor, who had rarely seen her usually reserved brother display such open affection. "The wedding will take place in 3 months," Alexander stated firmly. "You can either support us and be part of our happiness, or you can continue to oppose it." "But either way, Rose will become my wife." Eleanor looked at the couple before her, her powerful brother who suddenly seemed years younger, and the gardener who had somehow managed to break through his carefully constructed walls. Against her will, she felt her resistance beginning to crack. "Well," she sighed, reaching for a scone, I suppose I should at least try these before I make any final judgments. After all, any woman who can bake a proper scone can't be entirely unsuitable. It was a small concession, but both Alexander and Rose recognized it as the beginning of acceptance. As they sat together in the study, sharing tea and surprisingly comfortable conversation, the gardens outside seemed to bloom a little brighter, as if nature itself was celebrating this small victory. Yet even as they made progress with Eleanor, they knew bigger challenges lay ahead. The society wedding of the year was approaching, and with it would come scrutiny and judgment from all quarters. But as Rose and Alexander exchanged quiet smiles over their teacups, they knew they could face anything as long as they faced it together. The September morning dawned clear and crisp, with just enough autumn crispness in the air to make the gardens of Thornfield Hall glisten with dew. Rose stood at her cottage window, watching the army of wedding planners transform the grounds she knew so intimately into a fairy tale setting. Despite Eleanor's initial reservations, she had thrown herself into wedding planning with surprising enthusiasm, determined that if her brother was going to marry a gardener, it would at least be the most tasteful, elegant wedding the county had ever seen. The result was a stunning blend of sophistication and natural beauty, with Rose's beloved gardens taking center stage. "You look absolutely breathtaking," whispered Claire, Rose's childhood friend and maid of honor, as she helped adjust the simple but elegant wedding dress. The gown, designed by a top London couturier, managed to capture Rose's essence perfectly, understated elegance with subtle embroidery that mimicked the climbing roses she so loved. "I still can't quite believe this is happening," Rose admitted, touching the delicate pearl necklace Alexander had given her as an early wedding gift. "Sometimes I worry I'll wake up and find it was all a dream." "Well, it's very real," Claire assured her, fixing a loose strand of hair. "And you deserve every bit of happiness coming your way. Though I must say the guests arriving look like they've stepped straight out of Tatler magazine." Indeed, the guest list was a who's who of British high society, mixed with Rose's much smaller circle of family and friends. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. Titled ladies in designer outfits, mingling with Rose's former colleagues from the gardening world, all trying to navigate this unusual social situation. In his private dressing room, Alexander adjusted his cravat for the 10th time, his usually steady hands betraying his nervousness. His best man, James Wilson, his oldest friend and business partner, watched with amusement. "I haven't seen you this nervous since your first major business presentation," James observed, handing Alexander a glass of scotch. "And that was 30 years ago." "This is different," Alexander replied, taking a grateful sip. "That day I was just risking my financial future. Today I'm starting a whole new life." "You know," James said thoughtfully, "I've known you for over 3 decades, and I've never seen you as happy as you've been these past months. Rose is good for you, even if half of London society can't understand it." Alexander smiled, thinking of his bride. "She makes me see the world differently, James. Everything I thought I knew about success, about happiness, she's changed it all." The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of elegant simplicity. The garden's natural beauty provided the perfect backdrop, with chair ribbons matching the late-blooming roses. As Rose walked down the petal-strewn aisle on her father's arm, the assembled guests couldn't help but be struck by the genuine joy radiating from both bride and groom. Lady Victoria Pembroke, watching from her front-row seat, found herself reluctantly revising her opinion. The bride carried herself with natural dignity that even the most practiced debutante might envy. And Alexander, well, she had never seen him look so transformed. The reception that followed was a magnificent fusion of two worlds. Michelin-starred cuisine was served alongside home-baked treats from Rose's mother's recipes. Classical musicians played alongside a local folk band that Rose had often enjoyed. Somehow it all worked, creating an atmosphere of genuine celebration that broke down even the most rigid social barriers. As evening fell, Alexander led Rose onto the dance floor for their first dance. The string quartet began playing "The Way You Look Tonight," and for a moment it seemed as if everyone else faded away. "Happy," Alexander murmured as they swayed together. "Perfectly," Rose replied, her eyes shining. Though Lady Victoria nearly had a fit when she saw we'd included Morris dancers in the entertainment schedule. Alexander laughed, pulling her closer. "Let them talk. This is our day, exactly as we wanted it." Later that night, as the last guests departed and the cleanup crews began their work, Rose and Alexander stood in their favorite spot in the garden, now lit by thousands of tiny lights strung through the trees. "I have something to tell you," Rose said softly, turning to face her new husband. "I've been waiting for the right moment." But before she could continue, a commotion from the house interrupted them. Eleanor was hurrying across the lawn, waving a piece of paper. "Alex, Rose, the most extraordinary thing has happened," she called out, her face flushed with excitement. The news she carried would change everything, though none of them could have guessed just how much at that moment. The fairy lights twinkled above them, casting a magical glow over the garden where their story had begun, as they stood on the brink of their greatest adventure yet. Eleanor's hands trembled as she handed the paper to Alexander. "The clinic called while you were dancing. They've been trying to reach you all evening. The results of Rose's recent fatigue and dizziness. They're not just wedding stress." Rose clutched Alexander's arm, her heart racing as he unfolded the medical report. His eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed unable to speak. "Rose," he finally managed, his voice barely a whisper, "you're pregnant." But Eleanor wasn't finished. "Keep reading, Alex. There's more." Alexander's hands shook as he continued reading. "Triplets," he breathed, looking up at Rose with wonder. "We're having triplets." The paper fluttered to the ground as Rose fell into Alexander's arms, both laughing and crying at once. The doctors had been so certain about Alexander's condition that they hadn't even considered the possibility of pregnancy when Rose first reported feeling unwell. "But how?" Alexander asked, still dazed by the news. "The doctors always said—" "Sometimes medical science doesn't have all the answers," Rose said softly, thinking of their garden. "Nature has its own wisdom, remember?" The news spread through London society like wildfire. The whispers that had barely died down after the wedding now returned with renewed vigor. At the prestigious Wellington Club, Alexander's peers debated the possibility of such a miracle, while their wives gathered at elaborate tea parties to speculate about the truth behind the pregnancy. Lady Victoria Pembroke was particularly vocal in her skepticism. 3 babies? After all these years of him being unable to father children? "It's preposterous," she declared to anyone who would listen. But Rose and Alexander remained in their bubble of joy, transforming Thornfield Hall for the arrival of their 3 little miracles. The East Wing, which had stood empty for years, was converted into a gorgeous nursery suite. Rose insisted on incorporating natural elements into the design, bringing the garden she loved indoors with hand-painted murals of trees and flowers. Dr. Sarah Chen, their specialist at the London Fertility Clinic, was equally amazed by the pregnancy. While extremely rare, there are documented cases of spontaneous pregnancy after years of infertility, she explained during one of their checkups. But triplets in such a case, that it's extraordinary. The pregnancy itself became a journey of discovery for both of them. Alexander, the man who had built his empire on careful control and planning, found himself completely at the mercy of Rose's cravings and mood swings, yet he approached each new challenge with a tenderness that surprised even him. "I never thought I'd be sending my driver out at midnight for pickled onions and chocolate ice cream," he laughed one evening, watching Rose contentedly devour her unusual combination. Rose smiled, her hand resting on her growing belly. "Just wait until you meet these 3. I have a feeling they're going to keep us on our toes." As the months progressed, they began attending specialized parenting classes for multiple births. The sight of Alexander Montgomery, one of Britain's most powerful businessmen, practicing diaper changes and swaddling techniques on plastic dolls, caused quite a stir at the exclusive private hospital. Yet something was changing in London's high society. The genuine joy and love between Rose and Alexander began to win over even their harshest critics. Their story of persistence, love, and unexpected miracles touched hearts and transformed perspectives. One afternoon, as Rose rested in the garden, she could no longer tend but still visited daily. She felt the babies move in perfect synchronization. "They're dancing," she told Alexander, who had taken to working from home more often to be near her. He placed his hand on her belly, feeling the movement of their 3 tiny miracles. "Just like their mother," he smiled, remembering their first dance as husband and wife. But even as they celebrated their joy, Rose was forming an idea. Her own experience, combined with her knowledge of natural healing and her husband's resources, was spawning a vision that would soon change many other lives. She began making notes, researching and planning something that would become much bigger than herself. "Alex," she said one evening, as they sat in their favorite spot in the garden, watching the sunset, "I've been thinking about how we could help others who are struggling like we did. What if we could combine traditional medicine with natural approaches? Create a place of healing that treats the whole person, not just the symptoms?" Alexander looked at his wife, amazed once again by her capacity to think of others, even in the midst of their own miracle. The seeds of something extraordinary were being planted, though neither of them could yet imagine just how far those seeds would grow. The triplets, seemingly sensing their mother's excitement, moved enthusiastically. Rose laughed, placing Alexander's hand where he could feel them. In that moment, surrounded by the garden where their love had blossomed, they felt the full weight of their blessings and the endless possibilities that lay ahead. As Rose's pregnancy progressed, her vision for a revolutionary fertility center began to take shape. During sleepless nights, while the triplets performed their nightly acrobatics, she sketched out plans for a facility that would combine the best of modern medicine with holistic healing approaches. "We'll have gardens," she explained to Alexander one morning over breakfast, her excitement making her glow even more than usual. "Not just decorative ones, but healing gardens where patients can connect with nature. We'll incorporate meditation spaces, natural light, and elements that promote emotional well-being alongside physical healing." Alexander, who had initially been skeptical about alternative medicine, found himself increasingly intrigued by Rose's vision. He'd witnessed firsthand how her connection to nature and holistic approach to life had transformed not only his gardens, but his entire worldview. "Tell me more," he encouraged, watching as she spread her sketches across his antique mahogany desk, her expert gardener's hands now drawing blueprints for something far bigger than flower beds. "It's not just about fertility treatments," Rose continued, her passion evident in every word. "It's about healing the whole person. So many couples struggling with fertility feel broken, just like you did. We need to address the emotional and spiritual aspects of their journey, not just the physical ones." The project quickly became their shared mission. Alexander brought his business acumen to Rose's vision, beginning to see how they could create something truly revolutionary in the medical world. He contacted the best architects, medical consultants, and holistic practitioners, assembling a team that could bring their dream to life. Lady Victoria Pembroke, who had been gradually warming to Rose, found herself unexpectedly drawn into the project when she overheard them discussing it at a charity gala. "My niece," she said, approaching their table with uncharacteristic hesitation, "she and her husband have been trying for years. The finest doctors in Harley Street haven't been able to help. Do you really think your alternative approach might make a difference?" Rose reached out and took the older woman's hand, her genuine compassion breaking through the last of Lady Victoria's resistance. "Sometimes the path to healing isn't the one we expect. Would your niece like to be one of our first consultations when we open?" As word of their plans spread through London society, something remarkable began to happen. People started sharing their own struggles with fertility, stories that had been hidden behind proud facades and polite smiles. The whispers about Rose and Alexander's miracle pregnancy transformed into conversations about hope and possibility. Meanwhile, the triplets continued to grow, defying every odds and surprising their medical team with their perfect development. Rose's body adapted beautifully to carrying 3 babies, though she often joked that she felt like one of her prized watermelons had taken up residence in her midsection. Alexander threw himself into preparations for both the babies and the fertility center. The man who had once focused solely on corporate takeovers now spent hours researching organic baby products and sustainable building materials. His board members were shocked when he announced that Montgomery Investments would be creating a new division focused on healthcare and wellness initiatives. "It's about legacy," he explained to his bewildered board of directors. "Not just about passing on wealth, but about creating something that truly makes a difference in people's lives." One evening, as they sat in the nursery reviewing plans for the fertility center, Rose noticed Alexander had grown quiet. She found him staring at the 3 identical cribs, each decorated with hand-painted vines and flowers. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "About how differently everything turned out from what I'd planned," he replied, pulling her close. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be married to my gardener, expecting triplets and planning to build a revolutionary fertility center, I would have thought they were mad." Rose laughed, leaning into his embrace. "And now?" "Now I can't imagine any other life," he said, his hand resting on her belly where their 3 miracles grew. "You've taught me that the best things in life are often the ones we never planned for." Their tender moment was interrupted by a call from their project manager. The perfect property for their fertility center had just come on the market, a beautiful Victorian mansion set in sprawling grounds just outside London. As they listened to the details, both felt a spark of excitement. Their dream was one step closer to becoming reality. That night, as moonlight filtered through the nursery windows, Rose felt a particularly strong movement from the triplets. It was as if they too could sense the excitement of the future that lay ahead, a future that would not only change their lives, but the lives of countless others who had almost given up hope. "Your daddy and I have such plans for you 3, she whispered to her bump. "You're going to grow up knowing that miracles are possible, and that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow in the most unexpected places." The Victorian mansion that would become their fertility center stood majestically amid 12 acres of untamed grounds. As Rose waddled through the overgrown gardens, now 7 months pregnant, her experienced eye could already see the potential beneath the wilderness. "Here," she said, pointing to a sunlit clearing, "we'll create a meditation garden with healing herbs and flowers, and over there we can build a greenhouse for year-round therapeutic horticulture programs." Alexander watched his wife with amazement. Despite carrying 3 babies and being told repeatedly to rest, Rose's enthusiasm was infectious. The project had evolved beyond their initial vision, becoming something truly revolutionary in the world of fertility treatment. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been monitoring Rose's extraordinary pregnancy, had joined their team as medical director. "What you're proposing," she said during a planning meeting, "is a complete paradigm shift in fertility treatment. Combining cutting-edge medical technology with natural healing approaches, it's exactly what this field needs." The renovation work began immediately. Alexander insisted on using sustainable materials and green technology, something that would have seemed unnecessarily expensive to his former self. But Rose had taught him to think beyond immediate profits to long-term impact. One afternoon, as they reviewed plans in the mansion's future reception area, Rose suddenly clutched her belly and laughed. "They're doing it again, all 3 moving at once. It's like they're having their own little party in there." Alexander placed his hand on her stomach, feeling the synchronized movements of their triplets. These moments never failed to fill him with wonder. "They take after their mother," he smiled, always busy creating something new. The project was drawing attention from unexpected quarters. Medical journals requested interviews about their integrated approach. Environmental publications praised their sustainable design. Even skeptical members of London society were beginning to see the merit in their vision. Lady Victoria Pembroke had become one of their strongest advocates, especially after her niece began showing promising results from their pilot program of combined traditional and alternative treatments. "It's quite revolutionary," she declared at her weekly tea gatherings, which had transformed from gossip sessions into informal support groups for families struggling with fertility issues. The renovation work proceeded rapidly, but not without challenges. One morning, their contractor discovered structural issues that would require significant additional work. As the project manager explained the delays and extra costs, he expected Alexander Montgomery, notorious for his exacting standards, to explode. Instead, Alexander simply nodded. "Safety and quality come first. Make whatever changes are necessary." He turned to Rose with a gentle smile. "Sometimes the strongest foundations are built on unexpected challenges." Rose squeezed his hand, recognizing his words as an echo of their own journey. Their love had faced skepticism and judgment, only to emerge stronger. Their miracle pregnancy had defied medical certainty. Now their fertility center would offer that same hope to others. As the due date approached, the project took on increased urgency. Alexander wanted everything perfect before the babies arrived. The medical wing was equipped with state-of-the-art technology. The therapeutic gardens were taking shape under Rose's careful direction, though she now had to supervise from a comfortable chair while her team did the physical work. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Rose and Alexander stood in what would become the center's main garden. Despite her doctor's orders to rest, Rose had insisted on being there for the planting of 3 special rose bushes, one for each of their miracle babies. "It's perfect," Rose said softly, watching as the gardeners carefully positioned the rose bushes. "These gardens will grow along with our children, offering hope to others just as our story has." Alexander wrapped his arms around her, his hands resting protectively over their triplets. "When I first hired you to tend my gardens, I never imagined you would end up transforming my entire world." "Life has a way of surprising us," Rose replied, leaning back against him. "Just like these roses will bloom in their own time, every story unfolds exactly as it should." As they stood there in the fading light watching their dream take shape, neither could have imagined the extraordinary events that were about to unfold. Their fertility center was nearly ready, their babies were healthy and growing, and yet fate had one more surprise in store for them, a twist that would make their miracle even more remarkable. The nursery at Thornfield Hall was a testament to the merging of 2 worlds. Hand-painted murals of enchanted gardens covered the walls, while state-of-the-art monitoring systems ensured everything would be perfect for the triplets' arrival. Rose's natural aesthetic had transformed the space into a magical woodland, complete with ethereal butterflies and delicate flowers that seemed to dance in the soft lighting. "The bassinets arrived from Switzerland," Alexander announced one morning, watching as the custom-made pieces were carefully positioned. Each was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, with intricate carvings of roses and vines decorating the organic bamboo wood. Rose, now in her 8th month, moved slowly between the bassinets, her hand trailing over the delicate carvings. "They're beautiful, Alex, but you know they would have been just as happy in simple cribs." "Nothing is too good for our miracles," he replied, though they both knew the extravagant nursery was more for his benefit than the baby's. It was his way of channeling his nervous excitement as the due date approached. Their days had fallen into a new rhythm. Mornings were dedicated to final preparations at the fertility center, though Rose now participated via video calls from her comfortable bed. Afternoons were spent with Dr. Chen, who monitored the triplets' development with increasing amazement. "It's remarkable," Dr. Chen said during one checkup, studying the ultrasound screen. "In most multiple pregnancies, at least one baby tends to be significantly smaller. But yours are all perfectly sized and developing in complete synchronization. I've never seen anything quite like it." The medical team had arranged for a specialized delivery suite at London's most prestigious private hospital. Given the unique nature of the pregnancy, they were taking no chances. Alexander had practically moved his office to the hospital's executive suite, ensuring he would be there the moment Rose needed him. One evening, as they sat in the nursery reviewing their birth plan, Rose noticed Alexander seemed distracted. "What's wrong?" she asked, recognizing the worried crease between his eyebrows. "I received another call from the Times today," he said carefully. "They want to do a feature story about us. The miracle pregnancy, the fertility center, everything. They're calling it the Montgomery Miracle." Rose understood his concern. They had managed to keep most of the pregnancy details private, despite intense public interest. The speculation about their miracle had only increased as Rose's due date approached. "Perhaps it's time," she said thoughtfully. "Not for our sake, but for others who might need hope. We could use the article to announce the opening of the center." Alexander's face softened. "Always thinking of others, aren't you? Even with 3 babies about to arrive." Before Rose could respond, she felt a strong movement from the triplets, different from their usual synchronized dancing. For a moment, she sat very still, her hands pressed against her enormous belly. "Rose?" Alexander was instantly alert. "Should I call Dr. Chen?" She shook her head, smiling. "No, they're just very active tonight. It's like they know we're talking about them." She took his hand and placed it where he could feel the movements. "Feel how they're taking turns now instead of moving together. I think they're trying to tell us something." Alexander knelt beside her chair, his face full of wonder as he felt each distinct movement. "Hello, little ones," he whispered. "We can't wait to meet you." The next morning brought excitement of a different kind. The final inspection of the fertility center was complete, and they had received full certification to begin operations. The first patients were scheduled to begin treatment the month after the triplets' arrival. As they celebrated this milestone, Rose shared her latest inspiration. "I've been thinking about adding a special garden at the center," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. A celebration garden, where families can plant something to commemorate their own miracles, just like our 3 rose bushes. Alexander was about to respond when Rose suddenly gasped, her hands flying to her stomach. This time, the look on her face was different. "Alex," she said calmly, though her eyes were wide, "I think it's time to call Dr. Chen. Our little ones have decided they're ready to make their appearance." The calm before the storm settled over them as Alexander sprang into action, setting in motion the carefully prepared birth plan. As the household erupted into organized chaos around them, Rose remained serene, breathing through the first contractions while Alexander held her hand. Neither of them could have predicted that the next 24 hours would bring surprises that would astonish even their experienced medical team. Their miracle was about to become even more extraordinary, in ways that would leave London society speechless and rewrite medical textbooks forever. The private wing of St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with controlled excitement. News that Rose Montgomery had gone into labor spread quickly through London's elite social circles, and the hospital's reception desk was flooded with calls from curious well-wishers and persistent journalists. Dr. Chen had assembled a team of specialists for the delivery, though she couldn't shake the feeling that this birth would be as extraordinary as the pregnancy itself. Rose's calm demeanor throughout her contractions was remarkable, especially for a first-time mother carrying triplets. "The babies are still perfectly synchronized," Dr. Chen announced during an examination, her voice filled with wonder. "Even their heartbeats are in perfect harmony. I've never seen anything like this in all my years of practice." Alexander hadn't left Rose's side since they arrived at the hospital. The usually composed businessman was a bundle of nervous energy, though he tried to maintain a calm exterior for Rose's benefit. She squeezed his hand through each contraction, her strength and serenity amazingly intact. "Tell me about our garden again," Rose asked between contractions, her voice steady despite the intensity of labor. "The one we're planning for the families at the center." Alexander smiled, grateful for her ability to stay focused on their shared vision even in this moment. "It will be magnificent," he said, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "We'll have a special section for each success story, with plants chosen by the families themselves." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Chen's return. "It's time," she announced, after checking Rose's progress. "These little ones are ready to meet their parents." What followed would become legend in the hospital's history. The delivery proceeded with an almost supernatural smoothness. The 3 babies, 2 boys and a girl, were born within minutes of each other, each perfectly healthy and remarkably similar in size, another rarity for triplets. "They're beautiful," Alexander whispered, tears streaming down his face as he held his daughter while the medical team checked the boys. Each baby had Rose's honey-colored hair and his gray eyes, a perfect blend of their parents. "What shall we name them?" Rose asked softly, cradling their firstborn son, while the second boy slept peacefully in a bassinet nearby. "For our daughter," Alexander said, looking down at the tiny bundle in his arms. "What about Flora, after your grandmother who taught you about healing gardens?" Rose smiled tiredly but radiantly. "It's perfect. And for our boys, Oliver and Jasper?" The names they'd discussed seemed even more fitting now, seeing their son's sturdy, healthy forms. The news of the triplets' safe arrival spread quickly. Eleanor was the first to visit, bursting into happy tears at the sight of her 3 perfect nieces and nephews. Even Lady Victoria Pembroke, who had appointed herself unofficial guardian of the Montgomery family's social standing, was moved to silence when she saw the babies. "Well," she finally managed, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, "they are absolutely perfect. And anyone who suggests otherwise will have me to deal with." The medical staff continued to marvel at the triplets' remarkable similarity in size and their synchronized behaviors. When one would wake to feed, the others would follow within minutes. They seemed to communicate with each other in ways that fascinated the pediatric team. As Rose recovered, she and Alexander spent hours in the private suite, getting to know their miracle babies. Each child had their own distinct personality. Flora, already showing signs of her mother's gentle spirit, Oliver, with his father's thoughtful gaze, and Jasper, who seemed to combine both parents' strength and determination. "I never dreamed this could be possible," Alexander confessed one quiet evening, as all three babies slept peacefully in their hospital bassinets. Not just having children, but this completeness. Rose reached for his hand, understanding exactly what he meant. Their family felt whole, perfect, as if every challenge and struggle had been leading to this moment. But even as they celebrated their personal joy, both knew their journey wasn't just about them anymore. The fertility center was set to open in a few weeks, and already there was a waiting list of couples hoping to experience their own miracles. Rose's combination of traditional medical treatment with natural healing approaches had captured the imagination of both the medical community and the public. As the sun set over London, casting a golden glow through the hospital window, Rose and Alexander sat together, watching their sleeping miracles. They had no way of knowing that their story would inspire countless others, or that their fertility center would become a beacon of hope for families around the world. 3 perfect miracles, Rose murmured, her voice full of love and wonder. And to think this is just the beginning of our story. Alexander kissed her forehead gently, his heart fuller than he'd ever thought possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and adventures, but for now, they savored this perfect moment with their miracle triplets, knowing their lives would never be the same again. The homecoming to Thornfield Hall was like something out of a fairy tale. The gardens, which had continued to flourish under the care of Rose's carefully trained staff, seemed to bloom more vibrantly than ever as they welcomed the new arrivals home. The entire household staff lined up to greet their 3 newest residents, their faces beaming with genuine joy. The nursery, which had stood ready for weeks, finally came alive with the sounds of 3 cooing babies. Rose and Alexander quickly settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible to them just a year ago. The powerful businessman who once spent his days in board meetings now expertly changed diapers and prepared bottles, while the gardener who had transformed his grounds now balanced baby care with the final preparations for their fertility center's opening. "They're absolutely extraordinary," Dr. Chen remarked during a home visit, watching as all 3 babies tracked a butterfly that had found its way into the nursery. "Their development is remarkably advanced for their age, and their connection to each other is unlike anything I've ever seen in multiple births. Indeed, the triplets continued to amaze everyone with their synchronized behaviors and apparent ability to communicate with each other. When Flora smiled for the first time, her brothers followed within hours. When Oliver learned to roll over, Jasper and Flora mastered the skill on the same day. The story of the Montgomery triplets had captured the public's imagination. Requests for interviews poured in from around the world, but Rose and Alexander carefully controlled their family's exposure, agreeing only to share their story in ways that might help others struggling with fertility issues. One morning, as Rose sat in the garden with the babies, she noticed something remarkable. The 3 rose bushes they had planted, one for each child, had grown and bloomed with unusual vigor. Each bush produced flowers in slightly different shades. Flora's bush bore pale pink blooms, Oliver's deep red, and Jasper's a unique sunset orange. "The gardens know," she told Alexander when he joined them during his lunch break. "They're celebrating our miracles in their own way." The fertility center's opening day arrived 6 weeks after the triplets' birth. Rose had insisted on being there, despite Alexander's concerns about her taking on too much. The 3 babies, perfectly behaved as always, slept peacefully in their carriers as their parents cut the ribbon to officially open the Montgomery Center for Fertility and Healing. The center itself was a testament to their shared vision. State-of-the-art medical facilities blended seamlessly with healing gardens and natural therapy spaces. The waiting room felt more like a peaceful retreat than a medical facility, with large windows overlooking carefully designed therapeutic landscapes. "This is more than just a medical center," Rose explained to the assembled guests and press. "It's a place of hope where we combine the best of modern medicine with the healing power of nature. Every person who comes through these doors brings their own unique story, and we're here to help them write their happy ending." The first success story came sooner than anyone expected. Lady Victoria's niece, who had been part of their pilot program, announced her pregnancy just 2 months after the center opened. More successes followed, each one celebrated with a new planting in the center's celebration garden. As autumn turned to winter, Rose and Alexander settled into their new life. The triplets continued to thrive, bringing joy and laughter to every corner of Thornfield Hall. The fertility center's reputation grew, attracting patients from around the world who were drawn by its unique approach and impressive success rates. One evening, as they sat in the nursery watching their miracle babies sleep, Alexander turned to Rose with tears in his eyes. "Do you remember the day I hired you as my gardener?" he asked softly. "I thought I was just getting someone to tend my roses. Instead, you planted seeds of hope that grew into all of this." Rose smiled, thinking of how far they had come. "Nature has its own wisdom," she replied, echoing the words she'd said to him so long ago. "Sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow in the most unexpected places." Outside their window, the 3 rose bushes continued to bloom despite the winter chill, their flowers a constant reminder that miracles were possible. The Montgomery triplets were living proof that love, hope, and a little bit of garden magic could transform even the most barren ground into something extraordinarily beautiful. And this was just the beginning of their story. 5 years had passed since the miracle birth of the Montgomery triplets, and the changes they had inspired continued to ripple through society. The Montgomery Center for Fertility and Healing had become world-renowned, with satellite locations opening in Edinburgh, New York, and Sydney. Their unique approach of combining cutting-edge medical treatment with natural healing methods had revolutionized fertility treatment worldwide. Flora, Oliver, and Jasper had grown into remarkable 5-year-olds, their uncanny connection as strong as ever. They could often be found in the gardens of Thornfield Hall, each tending to their own rosebush under their mother's gentle guidance. Flora had inherited Rose's natural gift with plants, while Oliver showed his father's analytical mind, and Jasper combined both parents' traits in surprising ways. "Mummy, look!" Flora called out one spring morning, pointing excitedly at her rosebush. "There's a new bud and it's pink like mine." Rose watched as her daughter gently touched the developing flower, still amazed by how the children seemed to have their own special connection to the gardens. The 3 rose bushes had continued their extraordinary growth, becoming local legends in their own right. Gardening magazines had written features about the unique blooming patterns that seemed to mirror the children's developmental milestones. Alexander, who now spent more time at home than at his corporate offices, joined them in the garden. The past 5 years had softened him further, though he was still one of Britain's most successful businessmen. The difference was in his priorities and perspective. "The new wing of the centre is ready," he announced, scooping up Oliver, who had run to greet him. "The research facility will open next month." The research wing had been Rose's idea, a place where scientists could study the connection between natural healing methods and fertility treatments. Dr. Chen had eagerly agreed to head the research department, intrigued by the extraordinary success rates they were seeing with their integrated approach. "Lady Victoria called," Rose said, smiling as Jasper carefully watered his orange roses. "The support group she started has grown so much they need a bigger meeting space. Can you believe she's become such an advocate for alternative medicine?" Indeed, Lady Victoria Pembroke had undergone perhaps the most surprising transformation of all. The woman who had once been their harshest critic now led one of London's most influential support groups for couples struggling with fertility issues. Her weekly meetings had become a safe haven where people from all social classes could share their struggles and hopes. The Montgomery triplets had also inspired an unexpected change in how multiple births were viewed and treated. Their remarkable development and the unique bond they shared had sparked numerous studies into the emotional and psychological aspects of multiple births. "Do you remember when people doubted our miracle?" Alexander asked softly, watching their children play in the garden they had helped create. "Now we're helping create miracles for others." Rose nodded, thinking of the hundreds of success stories that had emerged from their center. Each one was celebrated in their special way, a new plant in the celebration garden, a story shared at support group meetings, hope given to others still waiting for their own miracles. The center's celebration garden had grown into a beautiful testament to perseverance and hope. Every successful pregnancy was marked with a new planting, chosen by the parents themselves. The garden had become a place of healing and reflection, where current patients could walk among living symbols of other families' success stories. "Daddy, can we show you what we made?" Flora called, pulling Alexander toward their special corner of the garden. The triplets had inherited their mother's love of growing things and their father's drive to create something meaningful. Together, they had started their own small garden project, 3 tiny plots where they grew flowers and herbs for the center's patients. Even at 5 years old, they understood the importance of helping others, a value their parents had instilled in them from the beginning. As the sun began to set over Thornfield Hall, casting a golden glow over the gardens, Rose and Alexander watched their children sharing their day's adventures. Each child had their own unique personality, yet they moved through life in perfect harmony with each other, much like the day they were born. "We've created something beautiful," Rose said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "Not just our family, but everything that's grown from it." Alexander pulled her close, thinking of how much his life had changed since the day he hired a gardener who saw beauty in unexpected places. Their story had become more than just a personal miracle. It had grown into a beacon of hope for others, proving that love and faith could bloom in even the most unlikely circumstances. The triplets' laughter echoed through the garden as they chased each other among the roses, their joy as pure and natural as the flowers themselves. They were living proof that miracles could happen, and that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts came in ways no one could have predicted. On a bright summer morning, 10 years to the day since Rose first stepped foot in the gardens of Thornfield Hall, the Montgomery family gathered for a very special celebration. The grounds were filled with hundreds of people, patients from the center, medical professionals, friends and family, all there to celebrate a decade of miracles. The once skeptical London Society had long since embraced the Montgomery story as one of their favorite modern fairy tales. But for those who knew them best, it was much more than that. It was a testament to the power of love, hope, and the extraordinary things that could happen when someone dared to believe in possibilities. The celebration garden at the fertility center had grown into a lush paradise, with winding paths leading past countless plants and flowers, each representing a family's miracle. Rose had designed it so that something was always in bloom, ensuring that hope remained visible in every season. "Look at all these stories," Flora said, now a wise beyond her years 10-year-old, as she helped her mother prepare for the day's ceremonies. "Each flower has a family." "Yes, darling," Rose replied, adjusting a nameplate beside a newly planted rose bush. "And each family has a story as special as ours." The Montgomery triplets had grown into remarkable children, still sharing their unique bond, but also developing their own distinct paths. Flora had already shown signs of following in her mother's footsteps, with an intuitive understanding of plant life and healing. Oliver had inherited his father's head for business, but combined it with his mother's compassion, often suggesting ways to make the center's services more accessible to those in need. Jasper had surprised everyone by developing a talent for art, creating beautiful botanical illustrations that now hung in the center's halls. Alexander, his hair now more silver than dark, stood at the podium addressing the gathered crowd. 10 years ago, I thought I knew what success looked like," he began, his voice full of emotion. "I had built a business empire, but my life was empty. Then a remarkable woman came into my garden and taught me that true success isn't measured in pounds or properties, but in the lives we touch and the hope we share." The ceremony included testimonials from dozens of families who had found their miracles through the Montgomery Center. Lady Victoria Pembroke, now one of their strongest advocates, spoke movingly about how the center had transformed not just individual lives, but the way society viewed fertility treatment as a whole. Dr. Chen presented the latest research findings, showing how their integrated approach had achieved success rates that exceeded all expectations. The center's methods were now being studied and adopted by fertility clinics around the world. As the formal ceremonies concluded, the gathering transformed into a joyful celebration. Children conceived through the center played in the gardens, while their parents shared stories and support with current patients. The Montgomery triplets moved through the crowd with natural grace, their presence living proof that miracles were possible. Rose found Alexander standing in their favorite spot in the garden, watching their children interact with the guests. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "Not in my wildest dreams," he replied, pulling her close. "But then again, I never imagined a gardener would come into my life and plant seeds of hope that would grow into all of this." They looked out over the celebration, at the hundreds of lives touched by their story. The gardens of Thornfield Hall had grown and changed, just as they had, becoming more beautiful with each passing year. The 3 special rose bushes, planted on the day of the triplets' birth, had flourished into magnificent specimens, their unique blooms a continued source of wonder. "Mum! Dad!" the triplets called in unison, running up to their parents. "Come see! There's a new flower blooming in the celebration garden." Hand in hand, the family made their way to the newest addition to their garden of hope. As they stood together, surrounded by the beauty they had created and the lives they had touched, Rose and Alexander knew that their story would continue to inspire others for generations to come. Their miracle had grown into something far bigger than themselves, a legacy of hope, healing, and the extraordinary power of love to transform lives. And like the gardens they had nurtured together, their story would continue to grow and bloom, touching hearts and creating new miracles for years to come. As the sun set on their 10th anniversary celebration, casting a golden glow over the gardens of hope they had created together, Rose and Alexander knew that this wasn't just an ending, it was another beginning. For in every new bloom, in every miracle child's laugh, in every tear of joy shed by new parents, their story lived on, proving that love could indeed make the impossible possible. And somewhere in the garden, 3 perfect roses bloomed in harmony, an eternal reminder that the most beautiful gardens grow in the most unexpected places.